Hey y'all, Ian here yet again. This week, I'm going to teach you about animation and acting in video games. I'll start by explaining what frame rate is. Frame rate is the frequency at which an imaging device produces unique consecutive images called frames. Frame rate is usually measured in the number of frames per second, or FPS. The higher your FPS, the more fluid your animation is. Video games come in a wide variety of frame rates. As part of this assignment, I'm supposed to provide examples of games that run at 2, 8, 12, 24, 29.97, 30, and 60 frames per second. Now, to be honest, I don't have good examples for all of these. There isn't exactly a database for video game frame rates, and a Google search for that information brings up a bunch of irrelevant bullshit. Like, for instance, even if you spell out frames per second, Google somehow thinks you want to look up first-person shooters, and puts results for that all over the front page. So bear with me. Anyway, 2 frames per second is extremely rare in games, even in the olden days. It's basically 1 frame short of a static image. But a good example is the old Game & Watch handheld games. Movement is incredibly static in those games. Like, if you move your character, he'll just appear adjacent to the space he was just in before, with no animation showing how he got there. Now, I couldn't find an example of a game with 8 frames per second, but the PC game 3D Monster Maze has a frame rate of 6 frames per second, and 6 is close enough to 8, right? I also couldn't find a game that regularly runs at 12 frames per second. But Shadow of the Colossus for PS2, which normally runs 20 to 25 frames per second, often slows down to about 10-15 when you're doing battle with a Colossus. As for 24, multiple people on a certain internet message board insist that Far Cry 3 only runs at 24 frames per second. I haven't yet played it myself, so I'll have to take their word for it. I don't know of any games that run at exactly 29.97 frames per second. But that is the standard frame rate for NSTC, the analog television system used in North America and parts of South America and East Asia. 30 frames per second is the standard frame rate for modern console games. Remember that now. Halo 3 is one of the many examples of a game that runs at 30 frames per second. Now, 60 frames per second is generally reserved for PC games, but it's not unheard of on consoles. For instance, the Time Splitters games were all 60 frames per second, and that was last gen. Alright, now that I got that out of the way, it's time to talk about motion capture animation versus performance capture. So, motion capture. Surely you've seen it in various films and TV shows. You know, it's when you wear this suit with little white motion detecting balls all over it, and this causes your movements to correspond with those of an animated character. It's often used in video games to attain a more realistic human-like animation. Often, if a game features real-life celebrity as a character, they'll hire the celebrity to come in and perform motion capture so that they can more authentically bring this celebrity to life in the virtual realm. Now, performance capture basically takes motion capture a step further. While motion capture is mostly just used to capture arm, leg, and torso movements, performance capture can track things like facial movements and individual finger movement. So you can capture a greater deal of expression. That's pretty much the only real difference between motion capture and performance capture. Finally, I want to also touch on the uncanny valley. This refers to the theory that We are comforted when a robot adopts a more human-like appearance, but only to a point. If it starts to get too human-like, we get a little creeped out. But if you keep going until you get to the point where the robot is so human-like we can't even tell the difference, then we're comforted again. The uncanny valley refers to the dip in the graph that illustrates this trend. Okay, it's time once again for a quiz. What is the standard frame rate for modern console games? Is it 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second? Pick one.